Yeah, museums on the web, exploring the past for the future. This has to do with a project that is mainly focused at this moment with a project that we did with the Royal Library in the Netherlands, but is actually a wider project that we're building, and that has to do with that we would like to know what is the past of museums on the web. And we do not only want to know that for this particular time frame, but we also like to know that for indeed future developments. Museums have been on the web since the early days, that is what we do know, but they haven't reflected a lot yet on their online presence yet. And we would like to know what happened in the last 20-25 years and what actually is going to be the future also of museums, what is going to be the new developments, and can this past also help them into these new developments? So indeed, I'm Karin de Wild, I'm at the University of Leiden, and I'm part of a wider network, which is a European network, which is studying also web archival studies. And with that, several colleagues were also looking into this particular topic. So today what I would like to discuss with you is actually the collection that we have built at the National Library of the Netherlands, where we started to build the collections, museums on the web. And first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about why this was a collaborative effort and also the benefits of that, and look into the URL seed list, how we created that, and some of the case studies that are part of it as well. And then I would like to go into a second part, and that is that we improved access to this collection as well, which is so important because I see that others within this panel are mainly coming from a web archival perspective, but I'm a researcher. So for me, having access to those collections is actually essential, and you will see that I will come back as well. I'm really happy that besides the playback mode, we also were able to actually get an access to the data through a Solar, and we will talk about that as well. And then I will end with what kind of histories could become interesting, and especially what histories within the Netherlands could become interesting in this case. But first, the collection. So the opportunity that I had was that I could work for half a year within the National Library of the Netherlands, and that is quite an exceptional situation which the National Library of the Netherlands is offering to researchers. They have a researcher in residence program, and that makes that we are able to actually, as a researcher, become part of the team of the library for half a year. And I cannot stress how important this is. First of all, because for researchers it's really important to start understand those collections. How were they built? How were they made? What are the opportunities, but also the restrictions of those collections? And how do we gain access towards that? But I think, on the other hand, having access also towards the team and actually start collaborating on building those collections was also something that was really valuable in this case. And I've heard even in the last days also that web archivists were saying the opposite as well, that they were saying, actually for us it's also interesting to start working with scholars to actually see how we can give access to those collections, but also to see, is it valuable what we have collected over time and what kind of histories can be written out of that. So having that collaboration started to be really fruitful also in these 6 months that we had at the National Library in the Netherlands, to really start having these conversations. And I think it is almost only possible when you're really integrated within the team, because as we know, within these kind of situation, having an interdisciplinary team in which you can really brainstorm together to come to solutions is essential. And that was really possible through this Researchers in Residence program. I do know not all of the libraries will have this opportunity, but I cannot stress the importance in this case. So indeed, what we see here is the development of how the collection, the web archive collection in the National Library has developed over time. So the National Library in the Netherlands started to collect actually already in 2006, but in 2007 they really started to have the first scrolls, and they started to continue developing their collection until today, which is at the moment a little bit more than 20,000 target records. The National Library doesn't have a legal deposit, and this has a huge influence, as we we discussed already in the previous presentation as well, on what can be collected and what cannot be collected. In this case, there needs to be an agreement with everyone, and because of that, with every website that has been collected, and because of it, there is a selective process. which is even partially manually selected. The National Library told me as well, they said, and I really agree on that, their emphasis in the collection is on quality of the websites that they can collect, and less on the quantity that we see in certain other web archives. But actually for our collection, we wanted to start forming a museums on the web collection. This was a benefit because museums are often the ones that do have an agreement with the library, and because of that, a lot of their collections are part of it. So we could indeed again do a manual process and start manually going through the different websites, through the seed list that the KB has also published online. But we decided to do it differently and to do it to do it more data-driven. So we started to look for sources in which we can find overviews of museums. In this case, 3 sources were mainly important. First of all, Wikipedia. I think for most of you who actually start doing data and data research, Wikipedia is becoming a more and more important source, but they have amazing overviews of Dutch museums as well. But 2 others, and that is more related indeed to the Dutch landscape, but we do have we have the Museum Register, and the Museum Register has an overview of all Dutch museums that are having a Dutch museum standard. And their website is also giving an overview of all the museums. And also the Museums Association, which is an institute that is actually representing museum professionals within the field. And we started to extract the data from these websites, and with that we created already a good overview of potential museums within the Netherlands. You can see that the different websites also complemented each other. Within Wikipedia we could find a lot of the museums, but less of the website. Also had to do with the way that I scraped actually Wikipedia and didn't had a Wikidata extraction, but we had a lot of the museums coming from Wikipedia in this case. And the other websites actually were giving a very much comprehensive overview of the museums and also their websites and also their current websites, which is also important to notify in this case. But we could search on both. So we could search on both the name of the museum as well as on the website. So it didn't matter if we had one or the other. This created already a list of more than 2,000 museums in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a small country, but quite dense if it comes to museums. Of course, there were some duplicates in it. I would say we had more or less around 1,200 unique museums. We also looked a little bit into the spread, which is actually okay for the Netherlands. We found it most important that we had museums from all the different provinces in the Netherlands. We see that some provinces have more museums than others, but that's also realistic. In the Netherlands, some provinces have also more museums than others. But this gave quite an okay spread, so we knew that we had also museums from all parts of the country. And this is then what we eventually were able to find. We could find 860 a little bit more, but 860 museum websites within the KB library, which is quite a good result. And this created the first, at least, overview of the museums on the web collection. I have to say, I said there were 3 main sources, but we had a little bit more extra sources because, especially in the early days, we also wanted to find out, for example, the virtual museums and early personal collections that has been created on the Access for All. These were, of course, not part in the overviews that I showed you, but we were able to catch some of them as well. These are the special collections of the National Library. There are more or less 3 categories, the smaller size, the middle size, and the larger collections. These are the middle size. There are around maximum 500 target records. And what we see is that actually this is where most of the current special collections are situated. So we see that most of the middle-sized collections are not going over 500. There are only 2 special collections that they call large special collections that go over the 1,000 target records. So I think with actually creating a collection of 860 seeds, we were really having one of the bigger sub-collections within the KB. And besides the URL seeds, we also wanted to have an overview of interesting case studies that could be found within this collection. So we also created, and that was a manual, really historical research of specific case studies that had an historical significance. So we created an overview of 36 case studies which had some form of historical significance in the history of museums on the web. They were all described as well, so people also can look up those case studies and find out why they have been important. So those historians who are interested in actually picking up one of those case studies and starting to research them further also have the opportunity to go into this overview. What we found out is that of these historical case studies, not all of it were already collected, or sometimes they were captured, but they were captured only for a part of it. So based on that, we also built a new acquisition proposal and decided to acquire new websites. Sometimes these websites were still on the live web, so it was possible to crawl them. Others were actually part of the Internet Archive, and we're looking into if it's even possible to actually start collecting them based on what is within other web archives. But this is a whole new step to take, which we haven't taken yet, but there has been also made a new acquisition proposals. But then the other part of it was access. So when I came into the National Library, there is the possibility to go to the reading room, and within the reading room, there is the possibility to actually go and have a playback of the websites within the archive. So that gives you as an historian a really good insight in the look and feel of those websites, but it gives less an opportunity to go into the data. Well, I think most of you have seen this all, but this is, for example, the Rijksmuseum. It is the one from the Internet Archive, because in the reading room of the National Library, we're not allowed to take anything of that take screenshots of them. But this is one of the, where we can see the overview of the Rijksmuseum. So it gives us a timeline, and based on that, we can also have a really good look and feel of how the website looks at. But what we really wanted as well is to gain access to the data. And that gives two opportunities. We have seen them a lot in the last days, but that gives us the opportunity to indeed go to the Archives Unleashed, or indeed go and experiment with the Solar. And that's what we did. So this is the first special collection in the National Library, and I'm really happy I'm seeing Willem-Jan Faber here, who has actually played a huge role in that. It's the first special collection that is able to be viewed to be explored through a Solar. So here we see that we can search through the data of this special collection as well. Personally, I do know that it was discussed in previous days as well that some people have difficulties with the search of the Solar, but I think it's already a huge improvement than what we have, because the Solar is able to not only look into the URLs, but is also able to look on free text, on images, and there's quite a good search syntax. So it's much better to actually find your data through the Solar, I think, than what we had before. And I think a very important thing as well is that through the Solar, you're able to extract a WAC, which for some researchers, they really find this important. But for me, it was also really important that it's possible to extract CSVs. And within that, the Solar has 60 data fields, which I found quite remarkable. I didn't know Solar had so many. Of course, the full text is, for legal and ethical issues, quite difficult to share for web archives, but for researchers, this is such an important one to have. And the Solar is able to actually extract that. When you're doing a search with the Solar, you're able to select every of those 60 fields that you want and create your own CSV with it, which is actually an amazing opportunity to start the data analysis on these websites. There is a data dictionary as well, and I think for a lot of researchers this is enormous important, but maybe not always able to find, because the NetArchive suite is quite extensive. But we extracted that so that so that researchers can have direct access also to the data dictionary. But if you have any questions on that, you're able to find it as well within a NetArchive suite. So here we see already a part of the data that is possible to extract. So the toolkit, the toolbox that is in there gives already opportunity to have some standard data visualizations. Here we see, for example, a link graph of the Stedelijk Museum website, which is showing the inner and outer links. This can also be extracted to Gephi, which a lot of researchers will possibly love a lot, because then you actually can start tweaking it yourself a little bit more. What we do see is that these toolboxes are also extremely handy to see what is already the scope of the collection, because for the first time we could also see what was and what wasn't collected from these websites. And I think this is another thing that could be very useful when you start having an implementation of Solar or any other system, is that it gives a lot of insights in what the scope of those collections is as well. We can see already from this small little graph that not the complete website of the Stedelijk Museum has been collected. This is quite normal, of course, but what isn't this particular part of the website that is collected and what isn't? That is for us, I think, something that we're still looking into, and for researchers this is extremely important. The endpoint of the Solar can be used to also start developing your own dashboards, and I'm really happy that the National Library also offered the opportunity to work on some dashboards with me. Mirjam isn't here, I see, but she was really helpful in also developing new ones, and the first one that we found really important was, again, around the scope of the collections. What can be found in one collection, what can be found in another? So we decided that we wanted to have exactly the same dashboard as the Internet Archive is actually having, to show what the scope of their collection is, so that as a researcher you can really start looking into those two dashboards, compare them and see what one archive has and what the other archive has, and also take a look at if they can be complementary to each other. Actually, my slides are going automatically. But here we can see it a little bit further, how you're able to select the special collections that the KB library has. And also you can look for a specific website and then start looking into a little bit more the overview of which data can be found within this collection. Here I want to note that actually I think that it would be very useful to have a work group once maybe between the different web archives and also researchers, and having a datathon around this to improve those dashboards so that it can really give further and deeper insights in how different collections can complement each other when it comes to data. These dashboards are also again connected to and that's, I think, the nice thing about the Solar as well. It's called Solar Wayback. So the Solar has again a connection to the Wayback as well. When we want to look into the scope of the collection, what can be found in one or another, it's very useful to go back to the websites as well, and sometimes look into the look and feel of those websites as well to see what exactly is going on. So this particular dashboard, as the one as in the Internet Archive, has also the opportunity to go into the list of URLs again, and then click on those URLs and see them again within the playback environment to see what's going on, if you want to go from a more quantitative to a more qualitative approach towards this. So currently the Wayback is accessible, or the Wayback machine is accessible in the reading room of the KB. So for those of you who are interested, you're more than welcome to visit it. The Solar will be in due time. And from a researcher's perspective, we have already discussed that it would be really interesting to have a workstation. But yesterday, I think it was mentioned with the BNF that they're even having a data lab in which there is a physical space in which researchers can actually, and researchers and I think also web archivists together, will be able to brainstorm or have a datathon together, and also have access to the different possibilities to access the web archive. So both going to the playback view, but also going towards the Solar. That would be, of course, would be ideal. But we hope also that the Solar will be made available to researchers, for sure, or people outside of the library through a workstation. Then the histories. What can be written? So it's quite interesting that within the Dutch history of the web, possibly we will find one of the first virtual museums. So the first virtual museums went online in the early 90s. But the interesting thing is that, and we saw it also during the opening of this conference, is that the Netherlands had one of the first websites. The third and the fourth website on the web in Europe was actually Dutch, and the Digital City was one of them. And within this Digital City, a pioneering social media platform where people can have built their own homepage, where people could discuss things on their forums, in their first interface, we actually found one of the first virtual museums, the temporary museums of Walter van der Kruijsen. He was in the time connected to various developments within Europe who were actually thinking about how we could display but also store art within a virtual environment. And the ideas that they had around that time about preservation of arts and artifacts within the online realm is something that like I think heritage institutions in general are still grappling with today. So he had this idea that this should be fleeting, it should be changing over time, it should of course also be stored within containers and then be distributed. All these kind of elements of course are part still of the early ideas, the pioneer ideas of storing digital heritage, but is still the things that are actually the foundation of our challenges today. So that temporary museum is possibly something that will give us further insight in that. But also the pioneers in open data collections are here within the Netherlands. Actually, I'm not mentioning here the museums of sound and vision where we are here today, but also they could be part of that. But I'm showing here the Rijksmuseum because the Rijksstudio, who opened in 2012, had a really interesting new policy around open data. Also there, the Netherlands possibly played a pioneering role and at least further built on the open data policies that we have today. So the Rijksmuseum has 500,000 artworks that are shared in the Rijksstudio, in which people are able to actually not only see them, but also to manipulate them and use them for their own purposes, which can be 3D printing, it can be that you actually want to make furniture out of it or print a t-shirt with it. Then the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is something that is, of course, happened all around the world. Museums had to close their door, but within that development, museums also had to find innovative solutions to still reconnect to their visitors. And also the Netherlands played an important role in that, with finding new ways. Here again, we see the Rijksmuseum, which was actually often on the forefront of those developments, in which they started to have a completely new virtual tour through their Gallery of Honors, in which they want to still have give people the opportunity to start visiting their museum. It was possible to actually visit the artworks, have access to them through scans, to high-resolution images that could actually dive into details that people normally wouldn't be able to see if they were in the museum itself. And of course, they also could get audio tours. And AI is making its mark. The interesting thing that is that when the data collections will become bigger and bigger, we need to have, of course, support by machines to start researching them. And this is where the iMuseum played a pioneering role because they hired their first AI curator. And because of it, they started to have a curator that is no longer a man, but is a machine, and who started to explore the collections and started to make new films actually out of their bits and pieces collections that they have. I'm happy to announce that we will present outcomes of the museums on the web also within the journal Internet Histories, where I will be together with my colleague Nadia Profosnik. We're going to have a special issue, which used to be a special issue, now it's a double special issue because we had a lot of people who wanted to actually submit a paper to us. And we will also present the outcomes on the RESAW in Marseille, where we have an amazing panel together with Jonathan Bowen, who's one of the pioneers if it comes to writing the histories of, of museums on the web. Mette Skoff, who's doing a similar research than I do, but then in Denmark. Nadia Profosnik, who's doing similar research, but then in Germany. So then we can really bring also the international perspectives together. So really, really big thank you to the researcher and resident team. I'm sitting over there. Thank you so much for making this possible and having this collection within the National Library. And that was it. Thank you so much.